Blaze Backer is from the New York City Department of Small Business Services. Liz Luskin is from the Long Island City Business Improvement District. Connie Fishman and Tony Simone are from the Hudson River Park Friends, and me. So the first speaker is Blaze, and Blaze is really, I think, probably the city's bid expert, working at the Department of Small Business Services, where he's the Deputy Commissioner for Neighborhood Development and oversees the city's 76 existing business improvement districts. And prior to that, he worked in the bid world, operating as director of the Myrtle Avenue bid in Brooklyn and serving on the board of directors of the Bid Association, which is the consortium of all bids in New York City. He has a master's in urban planning, and prior to coming to New York City to work on bids, he worked in the private sector as a technology consultant. So he's got a lot of great background for the conversation today. Blaze?
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for the intro. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and give a pretty quick Bids 101, kind of a bit of a whirlwind probably in some ways compared to what we might normally do. But I think it would be a helpful way to just give you y'all a good picture of the program. So hopefully, I'm not seeing it yet. Don't know if you, okay, there we go. All good. All right, so just to jump in really quickly. So I just want to give, again, I'll go through, a little of, the bid program from our role, but as well as formation side, but just quickly on SBS. So for those who aren't familiar with small business services, we work to unlock economic potential and create economic security for all New Yorkers. So we're a non-regulatory agency, and we work sort of in the workforce development space, business development space, and sort of the neighborhood development space, which is what I oversee. And so specifically, so we refer to ourselves NDD, Neighborhood Development Division, and we work with community-based development organizations, both to steward the public realm, but also create some of the local conditions under which businesses can grow and thrive. And we do that working with, we say community-based development organizations, that's a bit of our catch-all term to refer to sort of a number of sort of place-based organizations that work to support commercial districts. So here, of course, talk a little bit about bids. So the quick, one pager on bid history in New York City, for those who might not be familiar with it, really came about initially in the 1970s during the economic crisis that the city was facing. The first sort of bid-like sort of legislation passed was something called SADs, Special Assessment Districts. So this was state legislation passed in the 70s. So, and 4 SADs were sort of initially created in the 70s. And then the early 80s, the bid legislation was passed both on the state and city level, with Union Square being our first bid in the city. And so, of course, starting with these 4 SADs in 82, the bid program grew, relatively quickly over time. And not without a ton of work, obviously, with people on the local level doing all that organizing work and getting us through various processes to get these into place. And here we are today on 2021 with 76 total bids, investing 170 million across all those neighborhoods within those boundaries. About half of our bids are in low to moderate income neighborhoods, and really, servicing, almost 45,000 properties and 93,000 businesses. So just the basics on the bids. I know a lot of you might know this already, but I'm gonna give, again, the quick version. So a bid, whether it has, you're probably familiar with some, whether it has a neighborhood name or an avenue or street name, they still all have a map, right, that looks something like this, that literally outlines tax lots within the city. And those are those properties are either within the bid or they're outside of the bid. And that is literally written into the law, and that's where services are provided. And how bids are funded. Again, you're probably somewhat familiar with this, but these, essentially a formula is created during the formation process, what we call an assessment formula, that takes into account, that uses different variables, and each bid is different in this way. Because the point is to come up with a formula that ensures the properties sort of pay assessment that is in proportion to the benefit that they receive from the services. So in a commercial districts, of course, we're looking at sort of the linear frontage in some cases, commercial square foot, assessed value or lot size, or any combination of these. And of course, how it works, right? The City of New York, our Department of Finance works with us in the bid to collect those funds, just like, from the property owners, right? So this is collected just like real estate taxes are collected, and 100% of those funds are deposited in the bid's account. And then of course the bid provides those supplemental services and improvements sort of back to the district. And while we obviously talk a lot about assessments, because that's really what allows bids to function and some, a sort of guaranteed source of income, bids have continued to, do fundraising and do additional programming that goes above and beyond their assessments. As you see now, assessments across the program, assessments are making up about 74% of revenue. An important piece of bids is, of course, how they're governed. So this is written very clearly in the bid law. That essentially a bid board must have 4 elected officials, as stated here, with the mayor sort of being that seat is the seat that me and my team represent on bid boards. It says it must have a minimum 1 residential tenant and a minimum 1 commercial tenant, and that property owners must be in the majority. So taking all that up, it ends up being that your minimum number of property owners you must have is 7, which gets you to a 13-member board. Of course, many boards are much larger than that, but as the law is written, the property owners must stay in the majority. So our role at SBS, again, we are the oversight agency for bids. So that really is like, working with the bids and overseeing their governance. They are ensuring they have proper board representation. They, submit audits to us. They have a contract with SBS. So some of the basic oversight responsibilities given the money that is being managed by them. We provide a lot of effort to support to strengthen bids. So this is really, in some cases, facilitating best practice sharing among the bids, but also doing a lot in terms of, when it's, again, leadership transition, hiring, legislative and technical assistance. Really does depend on sort of the neighborhood and the organization and many and what might be happening in the neighborhood. And then finally, we work to help the network grow, and that's when neighborhoods and stakeholders come and are interested in forming new bids or expanding an existing bid. And when that happens, we provide a lot of the data and tools and expertise that they might need, and really ensure that that the process that they go through in doing that outreach and formation is transparent and inclusive, and that kind of looking out for red flags and things that might obstruct the process as it goes through the formation effort. And so again, this is super quick, but this is what I would call, so planning, outreach, and legislative authorization. This is the very basics. It's obviously a lot more complicated than it looks in these three arrows, but the planning and outreach phase, is a lot of work, right? I mean, the legislative authorization process is something that we can get into later. That is, a pretty almost like a ULURP for those who know rezoning and land use like process. But the planning and outreach really is where local neighborhood and stakeholders and consultants and whatever team might be put in place to do the work. It takes a lot of time. And while we put here 18 to 24 months, that is really, we use that because it doesn't need to be very long. It is relatively straightforward, but the reality is when it takes 18 to 24 months, it's when there's sort of an organization ready to go, already has sort of a lot of context and relationships in the community where they're taking on this work and has staff or a consultant dedicated to it. And then it can take that. A lot of them do take longer at times, but it really does depend on the local situation on the ground. So just a couple things to leave you with really on, why we sort of think bids are really certainly a great model in the economic development space and potentially in several others. They are, key that they're locally governed organizations. While we have electeds on the board, they are locally controlled. Again, funded locally, but the city helps streamline that collection process. So you're not going door to door begging and pleading when fundraising. The services are locally customized, and they are, of course, supplemental. So they do not replace city services, a very important aspect. They are adaptable. While there are best practices to be shared, of course, it's that local organization that knows best what the needs and conditions are on the ground, and therefore can adjust more quickly and nimbly than the city ever could. And of course, the fact that they've gone through this legislative process and that we do have electeds on the board and government officials, there is a really unique relationship with city government that I think is a really competitive advantage for them. And so just some things to keep in mind, given the context of the conversation here today. I just think it's worth everyone being aware of these 5 things. So again, by law, the bids must provide services, above baseline city services, and it's prohibited from replacing city services. This sort of quote is from literally the bid law, that benefit properties must pay in proportion to the benefit received. That our bids, as you all are probably well aware, continue to adapt and innovate and have been taking on more and more public space management in recent years. It certainly goes back a ways, certainly as early as Union Square and Bryant Park have played a role, certainly in big and prominent public spaces, but more and more of our bids continue to partner with the Parks Department and DOT to manage public spaces. The law explicitly uses the term business improvement district, but it's just something worth noting. Obviously, again, Bryant Park is a park, and it's been that bid has been maintaining that park for a long time. So there's certainly adaptability that's possible, and the fact that majority property owner control is required on the board. That is something, at least without legislative changes, is not something that could be modified. So that's it for me, and I'll pass it back to Chris, and happy to be part of the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Blaise. Now it's time for me to try and share my screen. There we go. So my job is to provide a little overview of the law, and I think Blaise already did a lot of that, so I'll move swiftly through it. And I also want to share a little bit about my perspective on, the role of bids or other private entities in operating parks and how they can be helpful, because it's an issue that's near and dear to me for my clients and in my personal life. In 2019, I had to do a presentation for New Yorkers for Parks, and I compared the operation and maintenance budget for New York City parks to what all of the independent park operators were raising in New York City. And I thought the numbers were kind of staggering. $500 million is the city budget in 2019 for New York City parks. That's not for capital projects. That's a whole different thing. This is for operation and maintenance. And the city has 29,000 acres of parkland to operate. And you compare that to about $250 million raised by a whole variety of independent park operators, from state corporations to bids to conservancies, operating about 5,000 acres of parkland. So you can see that the parks that are attended to by independent park operators are getting special treatment, and they look good because of it. And these are the types of entities that I'm talking about that I looked at when I tried to put together those rough numbers. As I said, state public benefit corporations. That includes the Hudson River Park Trust, which is actually a state-created entity. The parks on Roosevelt Island, the parks in Battery Park City. City-created corporations like Brooklyn Bridge Park and Governor's Island are operated by a city-controlled corporation. Private conservancies. Now, the most famous is obviously the Central Park Conservancy, but there's a whole bunch of other ones that have formal agreements with New York City to operate parkland. Business improvement districts that are operating parks, there aren't that many of them. I only count 4, maybe there's one I missed, I don't know, someone could tell me, but Hudson Square Bid, which I represent, Hudson Yards Hell's Kitchen Alliance, which takes care of Bella Abzug Park next to Hudson Yards, the new Hudson Yards. Bryant Park is operated by the Bryant Park Corporation, and the Union Square Partnership, which informally operates Union Square. Doesn't actually have a license agreement with New York City. I'd love to know if I missed one, so speak up if I did. There are also other types of organizations taking care of parks. There are organizations that have licenses from the Department of Cultural Affairs, like the Bronx Botanical Garden or Wave Hill. Those are actually city-mapped parks that are operated by independent nonprofit organizations. And then there's a whole bunch of organizations, including a lot of us on this phone call, that informally operate within parks without a license agreement with New York City. In the Bronx, the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance, which I used to chair the board of, the Friends of Soundview Park. There must be 40, 50, 60 others around the city that do a lot of important work and raise hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. As I said, to me, the results from these entities are amazing. Brooklyn Bridge Park, Battery Park, Wave Hill, Governor's Island, they look spectacular. And some of them are raising it through property assessments. In the case of bids, as Blaise mentioned, a special tax or assessment on property owners within the district. Other entities that I listed have other special arrangements through their statutes that created them or through their licenses with the city. So here's the law that governs what we're talking about today. In 1989, New York State amended the general municipal law to formally allow for the creation of business improvement districts. And there were several bids that were created before this law was passed through the law that existed since the 1970s that Blaise mentioned, or that were created informally. But this law really formalized the process. And essentially, to me, bids are private, nonprofit, charitable corporations that have to operate within the strict confines of the statute that they're created under. But they are charitable corporations. They can take donations, they can take grants, but they also get this special assessment that is collected by New York City. And the law is really focused on improving business districts. I don't think anyone would say that it was created to benefit parks. It wasn't. But it specifically allows bids to address parks and landscaping and plantings and public open space in how they use their assessments. And so the law can be used to create bids that are focused on parks. I don't think there's a legal problem with that. And there are four, as I said, that do that at least in part. And the foundation of all these bids is their district plan. And that gets drafted to detail the geographic boundaries, the assessments that are going to be placed on properties, what the bid is going to do. And really, bids can't stray from that. So any bid that intends to make its focus maintenance or operation of a park would have to make that goal and that purpose front and center in their district plan from the beginning, because they will be restricted in how they use their money unless their district plan is amended later on, which can be done. The last thing I wanted to mention about bids is a big difference between how the law governs bids outside of New York City and within New York City. Outside of New York City, property owners control the process, and they really need to affirmatively, for 51% of property owners need to affirmatively call for their municipality to create the bid for the creation process to move forward. But in New York City, it's really the mayor and the city planning commission and the city council that control the process. And the mayor can initiate the formation of a bid. And if it's approved by the city council, it's formed. Unless 51% of owners object in writing to the formation of the bid within 30 days of a city council hearing on the formation. And I put a red asterisk there because I think, as all three of the other presenters today will say, the law may say what I just read, but that's not actually how it works in New York City. I'm going to ask that question of Liz. New York City has its own law to implement the state law on bids, and it pretty much mirrors what the state law requires. And it lays out a sort of a formal approval process that bid creation goes through. It can be sponsored by the mayor, the city council member, 51% of owners, although I don't know if that ever happens. And then there are these strict timeframes in which the government bodies that are reviewing it can comment. You have 30 days for community board comment. You have 60 days for the city planning commission to review and comment with a public hearing. Then the city council has its review period and it has to hold a public hearing and then vote on the formation of the business improvement district. And they can approve it or not approve it unless 51% of owners object in writing, in which case they cannot approve the formation of the bid. I also don't know that that's ever happened, whether it's actually gotten to that point. I'll skip the governance section because Blaise talked about that. And I just wanted to point out that although the time periods laid out in the law may look relatively doable, and that they can certainly occur within the course of a year, years of preparation work will precede this formal time frame in terms of drafting the district plan, outreach to property owners, building support for the formation of a bid, et cetera. And I mean, I know of neighborhoods that have tried for years or for a decade to form a bid, only to succeed on the second or third try. So it is a long process, and I think the more you put into the beginning, the easier the formal approval process will be. I'm a lawyer, so I want to talk about litigation and lawsuits because that's what we like. But the bottom line here is that the bid law has really never been successfully challenged. And so forming a business improvement district, assessing property owners an extra tax, and using it to maintain public spaces is perfectly legal. And if you look at court decisions involving business improvement districts, the vast majority of them, aren't that many, but the vast majority involve slip and fall cases or negligence cases. But there has been a fair amount of litigation regarding private operation of New York City parks. And a few lawsuits were successful. And to me, the lesson from those lawsuits is that the courts will allow a private operator, whether it's a bid or a conservancy or any other private operator, a restaurant operator, to operate pieces of New York City parkland, to maintain pieces of New York City parkland, as long as they are doing it for the benefit of the public. But when public spaces get privatized or for the benefit of a few, that's where you run into trouble and you can face legal challenges and litigation. And as I said, there haven't been many lawsuits involving business improvement districts. The only one that's really notable that I'm aware of was from the 1980s, maybe early 90s, involving the Grand Central bid, which was sued for shooing homeless people off the streets around Grand Central Station. And there was a lawsuit there essentially saying that the Grand Central bid was privatizing the streets, acting like a government entity, et cetera. And the litigants lost that case. The court sided with the Grand Central partnership. And I'm just going to conclude with a photograph from Bella Abzug Park in Hudson Yards, which is a park that is operated by the Hell's Kitchen, the Hudson Yards Hell's Kitchen Alliance, which is a bid. And it's a fabulous park. It's small, but it's really well programmed. And you can see that it's surrounded by relentless construction. And the photograph, to me, really tells the story about why creating bids for parks is so important, because there's so much development happening in New York. And there will be another real estate boom after the COVID pandemic is over. And we need to find ways to capitalize on all that development and all the private resources that are going into development for the benefit of parks. And bids, forming bids or PIDs, park improvement districts, are really one great way to do that. And that's what was done here, where the buildings around this park pay for its operation and its maintenance. So that's it for me. And now we're going to move on to Liz Luskin. Liz is the president of the Long Island City Partnership and the Long Island City Business Improvement District, and she can talk about why there are two entities and how they work together, perhaps. Prior to her work in Long Island City, she's been involved in dozens of really important projects in New York City, from Sunnyside Yards to the Amazon project. She was also a deputy commissioner at the Department of Small Business Services. And Liz and I started our careers at the same place, working for near poverty wages at the Municipal Art Society as the Menapace Fellow. But clearly for you, it was a good gig because it launched an amazing career in public service. So it worked.
And good for you too, Chris. Yeah, no, I joked that was probably the best job one could ever have at that point in one's career, and certainly in those days, and it was a privilege. So greetings, everyone. I also spent some time consulting and helping to set up some bids, like the Hudson Square bid. So it's been wonderful watching that go along. So Long Island City. I hope all know, but it is the western edge of Queens, and the core of Long Island City is directly opposite Midtown, from like 34th Street up to 86th Street or so, dominated by the Queensboro Bridge, which is what we call it. In Manhattan, you call it the 59th Street Bridge, and lots of other infrastructure. The Long Island City Partnership has been serving this area. We're the local development corporation for 40 years. starting at a time when the area was primarily industrial. The bid was created by the partnership in 2005. Originally, just these purple area, just this purple area. The original attempt had been to create a much larger bid, but the character of the surrounding areas and this commercial core were very different, and there just wasn't that agreement as to what was needed or what the benefit would be and so on. And so the ultimate effort resulted in this much more highly targeted bid. And this isn't exactly contiguous with, but it represents the key commercial corridors where also there had been a 2001 rezoning to allow for major upzoning intended to strengthen the area as the fourth central business district. There was some commercial construction, there has been, but there's also been, as in New York in general, a lot of large scale residential, hotels, and other things as well. In 2010, 12, the city also spent about $80 million between these two areas to create out of a parking lot, Dutch Kills Green Park, a walkway, median here, some other improvements around and planted median and other improvements along Jackson Avenue. And the bid has a complicated relationship. We maintain the medians here, but we pay the Parks Department to maintain this small park and the bikeway greenway. And we have some responsibilities for some of the other improvements. The area has changed a lot historically, right? And it's gone from being a predominantly industrial area to an area that still has a thriving industrial base, but is also now very much a mixed use community with commercial and residential, lots of residential, as well as other things. And over time, the services, people wanted the services in other areas as well. I should say, by the way, and I'll talk about the services in a moment, but the when the bid was originally created in 2005, the area was not particularly safe in that area. And so there was a need for some uniformed security services, as well as sanitation and other things. Over time, it became one of the safest areas in New York City, the entirety of Long Island City. And so over time, we've phased that out and spent more money on other things, which I'll talk about again in a minute. So I arrived on the scene at the end of 2013. There had been discussion over a number of years already about expanding the bid to cover these other areas. Vernon Boulevard, which is sort of our 1950s Main Street. I'll show you some pictures in a moment. Continuing down Jackson. By the way, this is where the city building is, and potentially around here on 44th Drive. Just a couple more things about Long Island City. 8 subway lines, 15 bus lines, very much a transportation hub that dominates a lot of the landscape and drives the character in some ways. So we started in 2014 really formalizing that effort to expand the bid. And in 2017, the expansion was legally completed. So, years of amorphous conversation leading to a more formal effort, but it still took a long time. There was a lot of education that needed to happen, concerns about areas of very different character. And again, I'll show you those driving services that were a mismatch for other areas. So we eventually came up with this idea of the 2 sub-districts so that each area that sort of went together could drive its own basic service budget. So how much sanitation you needed on Queens Plaza, which has an enormous amount of traffic, versus how much you needed on 44th Drive, which had very little traffic, was a very different thing. But at the same time, get all the benefits of economies of scale. And people really did want to knit Long Island City closer together. The people of restaurants here want the people who are in offices over here coming here to have lunch, dinner, and et cetera. So, I mentioned Queens Plaza, which is where the bridge comes in. So it's dominated by the bridge infrastructure, the elevated 7 N and W. It's an incredible 4-story high stack of elevated trains along with the bridge, but very much, it feels like a commercial area, and normally fairly dense, but not so much today. This building is the building my office is in, which is where JetBlue is as well. Jackson Avenue, as you turn the corner there, which again goes down to, this is the former city building, the Altice. Major construction now has happened here. You can see that here as well. In this northern part of Jackson, the Jacks, which is over on the right there, is a huge new commercial building, but we also have major residential, mixed use, et cetera. Going farther down Jackson, it gets a little lower scale. This is 44th Drive, which this is where the elevated train is, the 7 there. Has the character more like Court Square at one end, and then it gets quieter and quieter as you go over towards Vernon. And you can see older multifamily housing with no retail there, and that becomes important for the bid assessment. And then Vernon Boulevard, our wonderful Main Street, again with low scale older buildings with lots and lots of restaurants and other things, but a lower scale street. In these areas, we provide sanitation. It's our biggest part of our budget. Everything from street cleaning to graffiti removal, snow removal, et cetera. We've also been putting out, this is part of Dutch Kills Green that I was talking about. We've started putting out doggy bags. We do other beautification efforts like tree pit planting, hanging baskets, tulips, and we just added some solar powered lights there. We do other beautification things like banners and so on. Lots and lots of holiday lights, graffiti removal, which has gone up exponentially recently. What's been happening, but that's a big thing. Security, as I mentioned, we do not have a uniform service, and it's a big geographic area, and you would need lots and lots of people. And in reality, it is very safe, except for things that are more serious, things that we really need the police to be there and to be involved. It's not going to be solved by a pay by the hour security. And we've focused a lot on really building up the relationships with the 2 precincts that cover the bid to make sure we have a very responsive relationship. We do a lot of informing our businesses of what's going on, storm warnings, et cetera. When open dining is going on, we do a lot of events. The partnership, the parent organization does an enormous number of events, but things to bring the community together and help beautify it. We do a lot of small business promotion and support. COVID-19 has brought about additional things. We've given out in all of Long Island City, but like 85,000 masks. We've been doing lots of business education about what the rules are, what the requirements are, what the grant opportunities are, and so on. Sanitation, we've been taking on more, cleaning public assets as well, and just a lot of different. Sorry, the slide didn't populate completely. A lot of different marketing and so on around that. And just for a moment, and then I'll hand it back. Even though we had very deep relationships in the community, again, that expansion process took a long time, as had the original process, because a tremendous amount of education was involved. Even people who are property owners in several bids may not really understand what a bid is and how it works, let alone people for whom this is a totally new concept. And coming up with the right services. I mean, most bids, it sounds like everybody's doing the same thing, but in reality, there's a great deal of difference and where your emphasis is. And you want to figure out what the people in your bid really need and feel is important, and then show how you're going to provide that for money that they feel is reasonable. And that all takes a long time, but it is a great way to continue to build your relationships with your neighbors and your partner organizations in the area. So I think those are the key things I needed to cover in my intro presentation.
Thanks, Liz. So the final presentation is from the Hudson River Park Friends, Connie Fishman and Tony Simone. Connie is the executive director of the Hudson River Park Friends. And prior to her operating this Friends organization, she was actually the president of the Hudson River Park Trust itself, which is the state agency that operates and funds the park. She has held a number of positions in New York City government, and she might find herself reapplying for her old job because Madeline Wills from the Hudson River Park Trust is retiring this week. So maybe you'll have your old job back. Tony Simone is the Director of External Affairs for Hudson River Park Friends. And prior to this work, he held several important positions in New York City government, most notably working with New York City Council Speaker Christine Quinn for many years. Prior to that, he worked in the private sector for Goldman Sachs, so he knows a thing or two about raising money, I think. And maybe he can tell us if Christine Quinn is going to jump into the mayor's race at the last minute. So I'll turn it over to Connie and to Tony.
Thank you. First, as publicly as possible, I do not want my old job back, so nip that in the bud right now. When Friends embarked on trying to create a neighborhood improvement district as opposed to a business improvement district in 2012, I was actually neither at Friends or the Trust, and neither was Tony. So we're presenting information here that we got for the most part from the staff person who was the most involved with creating the neighborhood improvement district back then. And we'll be as faithful as we can to what he told us, but certainly there may be different opinions on exactly how what happened. Unlike Liz's presentation, we're essentially talking about a district that didn't happen and failed for a variety of reasons. The original impetus for considering it, I at least am told actually preceded the effort in 2012 with a 2008 report that was done by the RPA. And I see Rob Pirani is here. He was probably involved in that, which looked at the property values adjacent to Hudson River Park in Greenwich Village, which at the time was the first section that had been created approximately 5 years after it first opened. And the conclusion of the study was that the park had a very significant positive impact on the adjacent blocks. I believe the study looked at the 3 blocks just to the east across the West Side Highway. And they measured that in the amount of investment in new real estate development, in the values of the properties that had been existing when the park got created, and then made some presumptions about the additional tax revenue that that would generate for both the city and the state, as well as jobs. And so, with that in mind, they started looking at forming a neighborhood improvement district. Tony, you've got the screen. You want to flip to the next slide? So HRPK, as it is now abbreviated, Hudson River Parks Maintenance and Operations, are funded exclusively by earned income and private donations. There's no relationship in terms of operating revenues that come from either the City Department of Parks and Rec or the State Parks Department. The city and the state are both owners of the underlying property, but they do not contribute to the operations. A very small amount of money comes in occasionally as discretionary grants through Friends from the local council people, but that is, probably typically less than $30,000 or $40,000 a year. So money that goes into operations maintenance is all private money for the most part. The effort to form the NID lasted 2 to 3 years, not including the time it took to do the RPA study. And we're told by the staff person then that all in, including the study, there was a cost of approximately $2 to $3 million total. That is a very high number when you compare it to other NID, PID, or BID efforts. Part of the reason was, there were some deep pockets involved in funding it, but also it's a 4.5 mile area that was going anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 blocks deep in different portions of the area. So whereas the catchment area of someplace else might be much smaller and costs $200,000 or $300,000 total after you get through your consulting fees and your political consultants and the people who are helping you draw up all this information, plus there was staff involved. would not be spending that amount of money. This was, you know, atypical, in part because of the very large area, in part because it serves 3 community boards that are adjacent to the park as opposed to 1, which is more typical. And there are many, many community and block association kinds of organizations nearby that, you know, needed to be spoken to. The improvement district, as you've heard, is, you know, the defined area which property owners and taxpayers are charged a special assessment to generate funds. Can we do the next slide, Tony? And in this case, the effort itself used internal staff, political consultants, paid consultants who were experienced in doing applications for business improvement districts. There were, you know, over the course of the time, anywhere from 3 to 5 total staffers and a volunteer steering committee. The Department of Small Business Services was said to be extremely helpful during this process. However, as was mentioned before, even though the rules may say otherwise, they wanted to see 85% of the responses from the local community, homeowners, condo, and co-op owners supportive of the neighborhood improvement district formation. And that is one thing that hit a snag and ultimately resulted in not going forward. The messaging at the time was really, you know, this was a new park. In order to keep it looking really nice and in great shape, a very low yearly contribution through a small assessment would keep up the maintenance and the operations to a level that the Hudson River Park Trust at the time wanted to highlight as something both critical to the social fabric of the neighborhood and to the economic role that the park was playing in the newly developing Far West Side at the time. This is a map. You know, it fits on one page, but Chambers Street downtown to 59th Street on the west side is a little more than 4 miles. You can see at the northern end, it goes 2 blocks deep. Those are actually avenues, so it's, you know, much larger than a typical block. And as you get farther south, it expanded further to the east. There were a number of situations where there were either existing bids or proposed bids where we had to have them removed. So you can see up at the, towards the right, the proposed Hell's Kitchen Hudson Yards bid was carved out, as was the Hudson Square Connection bid on the southern side. And then not reflected here, but I think later they also looked at carve outs for the Mitchell-Lama projects that are down in Tribeca, a block away, for the NYCHA projects in Chelsea. There are two very large ones there. And for the village houses, which are a little bit north of Houston Street, which I don't know if they were Mitchell-Lama or a subsidy program preceding that. So bit by bit, there were pieces taken out of this so that there wouldn't be overlapping assessments, and there also wouldn't be charges on affordable housing or public housing. They took a look at, you know, really were parks part of bids in other places, and as was discussed before, there were 4 instances where the bids support parks. And there were many instances where they supported residential assessments, but as you can see, really only a couple where they supported both, and where the park was sort of the focus of what was driving creating the neighborhood improvement district. We spoke sort of in a download to the former staff about, you know, what the advice was if you were trying to do this again. First and foremost was the organization of the residential property owners, particularly individual homeowners, condo owners, and co-op owners, to get them on your side early, since their view of paying the assessment is a much more immediate kind of feeling about what they're doing, something more emotional than if you're dealing with large property owners who may have a lot of rental units and aren't themselves, in many cases, neighborhood residents. So that was, some of the opposition that was the strongest came from these individual co-op and condo owners. Hold lots of easily accessible community meetings with the local residents for them to participate and do many more than the minimum that are required by small business services. And in particular, if you have a large area like this, that includes many, many meetings for, you may have dozens of block associations and you want to have a meeting with all of them. So that can be very time consuming. One of the things they didn't do well, I think in their own minds, was anticipate where the major opposition was going to be coming from early. And that was, they probably dealt with the very large property owners the most and less with the individual small property owners, which is where a lot of the residential opposition came from. The next point was to talk early to your elected officials. The elected officials typically won't take a position in advance of knowing what the community thinks, but they don't want to be caught off guard. So you need to speak to them early to let them know about your intention to do bid or NID formation before they hear about it from community opponents or read it in some of the local newspapers. And that's something, they may not be on your side, but you don't want them to turn into people who are objecting to the effort based on what they see happening with the local residents. And the components, I think we've gone over pretty much. It's a lot of hard work: mailings, petitions, house parties, flyers, lots of community board meetings, block associations, public meetings in venues that everybody can reach. You don't want anybody to come and say, I wasn't consulted or I felt left out. Articles in the local press, if you can get them. And at the time, there was probably limited social media. I think that may be much more important to outreach these days because it's so much bigger in terms of communications. They were looking at an assessment in the area that was on average, based on the idea of a 1,000 square foot apartment, $75 a year. That doesn't sound like a lot, but for some people, literally any amount was too much. That, they just objected to this on principle. The NID encompassed the neighborhoods around the park, but the park is separated by the neighborhood from the neighborhood by the West Side Highway. So it was really on the other side of the street that all the property owners involved were living. The park itself was to be the main beneficiary, but the rules governing the creation of bids in general mean you have to spend money in the catchment area. So there were lots of discussions about how it would improve the neighborhoods, particularly on the streets running east-west, going from further east in the city, coming west out to Hudson River Park. Things like street trees and sidewalk enhancements and better lighting and more security. So all of the things that people who were in those neighborhoods wanted for their own neighborhoods were also going to be demands on the funds created by the NID that wasn't going to be exclusively for the park. And there needed to be neighborhood leaders on the board who were going to be able to negotiate those sort of the division of funds between how much should go to the park and how much should stay in the neighborhoods. As we talked about before, there was a lot of grassroots opposition from small property owners. Several of the homeowners had a fairly organized campaign, but it wasn't sort of organized in a way of funded by somebody uniformly. It was just a lot of local agitation that ultimately led to withdrawing the application itself. Some of the arguments, and I don't know if this is an argument that can easily be made in another park, but given how Hudson River Park's geography works, what they were concerned with was that they themselves, because they happen to have a property a block or two from the park, were shouldering the burden for everybody who was going to come use the park, which is far more people, millions more people use the park than just those 2 blocks. And I think ultimately the sentiment was this was unfair to those property owners, that they were paying way more than their fair share, even if it was an amount that didn't sound, excuse me, like a huge number. I think that's it.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Connie and Tony.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few quick points. So one thing I wanted to mention, as Connie had said about opposition, I think the biggest challenge they had at the time was Hudson River Park Trust was already an entity that existed. Many of the board members who were active on this initiative at the time said maybe it would have been less of a challenge if the park was brand new, but it was already a known entity run by a trust. So a lot of new homeowners came in saying, why do now we need a NID? And a lot of the opposition also used the name NID as one of their talking points, saying, well, this is not really NID, it's a bid. And why do I have to pay for a business improvement district when the park exists and they get funding from A, your donors, B, in addition to that, some government money for operation maintenance, even though it's very low, and council discretionary funding, which is only a few $1,000s. So the argument was maybe if the NID effort or bid effort was started earlier in the park's history, it would have been more positive. And like, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead, finish. I have a question for you.
Yeah, and then as Connie mentioned, the opposition really came from a few homeowners in one community board who did not want, they felt it was undemocratic for them to have to pay an assessment for a park that already had existed. And at the time, even though it was earlier in 2012, that park was, our park is still not finished clearly, but at that time it was even less so. And Tribeca already had a lot of the green space as opposed to community board 2 and 4. And that the other challenge was, it was 3 very distinct community boards. Politically, on the other side, at the time, I was working for Speaker Christine Quinn, and we didn't take any position, and the mayor didn't take any position at the time. It seemed at the time that the media painted it as a tax, kind of like the Highline experience, that we are now going to tax the west side when we already pay high taxes already, and the park already exists. Why isn't the city just paying it on its own?
You mentioned the Highline experience, and so there, 2 of the biggest, most beautiful new parks in New York City are Hudson River Park and the Highline, and they're 2 examples of bid failures or PID failures.
Yes.
Which is ironic. The Highline had its own effort to form a park improvement district around the Highline, which failed due to some similar neighborhood opposition, which Liz may be able to talk about. But it occurred to me as you were talking, Connie, that maybe the effort would have been more successful if Hudson River Park was a mess. In other words, let's face it, Hudson River Park looks very, very good. It's very well maintained, and the Highline is beautiful. The landscaping is just sumptuous. And maybe the neighbors would have mounted a less aggressive opposition campaign if it were a complete mess.
I don't think that's a crazy theory at all. I also think that both neighborhoods were developing at the time with very high-end housing or very high-end conversions in neighborhoods that had been previously mostly industrial or definitely not the character that you see in them now. And people who are spending sometimes, multiples of millions of dollars buying properties in places like Tribeca and Greenwich Village. But I think, Chelsea at the same time as Highline was forming is not that different. They felt like they were going to be paying a huge amount of property tax to the city of New York. And why were they being asked for something extra? I
Yeah.
don't
But
think,
the numbers you're talking about are not big. I mean, you're talking about $75 per average apartment in the case of Hudson River Park's Neighborhood Improvement District. And I looked at the Citizens Budget Commission, which did a survey of the bids in New York City. And the median assessment is less than $1,000 per property owner, which is a lot more than you were proposing for the residential property owners, but still, it's not an overwhelming or crippling amount of money. So clearly the assessment is not what's, the amount of the assessment is not what's driving opposition to the formation of bids or PIDs.
yes, that's correct. I don't think anybody was objecting because it was going to be $75 a year.
Right.
I think they would have objected if it was $1 a year in some cases, just on principle, you know, that this was not their responsibility. This was somebody else's responsibility.
Right.
And as you say, when they went outside and used the park, it didn't look like it needed anything extra.
I don't think I could find a piece of litter in Hudson River Park today if I went there. It's that perfect.
Chris, if I could,
Yeah,
If
Can I,
please.
can I, can I add one last point? I also think politically, the way Hudson River Park was formed, based on the different community boards, there's always contention. So Community Board 2, my very first job in government, I was the liaison to Community Board 2. It's not like Gowanus or smaller parks. A lot of folks, I mean, my boss at the time, rest in peace, State Senator Catherine Abate. My first boss in politics was a state senator that represented the area where Brad Harleman now is state senator. It was a tough position to be for Hudson River Park as a park run by a trust, because Community Board 2, many folks and homeowners at the time felt that they didn't want an entity as a trust or a conservancy running this park along the west side. It stemmed from the days of fighting Westway. They wanted just individual parks for the individual community boards, not this huge entity running.
Run by the Parks Department, run by the New York City Parks Department.
Run by the New York City Parks Department. And it wasn't
Be careful what you ask for.
Exactly.
Liz?
Also, you know, your
ahead.
statement about whether it looked too good or not related to this particular issue, but Hudson River Park has had, I don't know if it still does, but for many years, an operating agreement to take care of the bikeway, the buffers, and the highway medians in terms of trash pickup for New York State Department of Transportation. You know, every year they're a year late, literally, in paying for those services. And at any time during that history, if you were really frustrated that you couldn't get the money out of them, you just stopped picking up the trash. And, you know, directed people who were complaining because all of a sudden it was filthy to the State Department of Transportation, and immediately somebody wrote you the check.
Yep.
So there's definitely something to be said for not looking too good if you're going to be asking the neighbors to give you a little bit more.
Liz, I know you wanted to comment on something, but in your comments, could you also talk about the scale of the public outreach and education campaign that you think needs to precede any attempt to form a bid or a PID?
yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to echo what Connie was saying, that this is about principle, not just about money. And this gets down to exactly the kind of outreach you have to do, right? This is not wholesale politics. This is retail politics. You have to go door to door, door within a door. You know, you can't just go once to the building. You have to try and reach everybody because of a few things. One, you won't really know if what you're doing is what the community wants if you don't talk to lots and lots of people and get a good sense of that. You won't really know what they don't want unless you hear from them. And the reality is, as folks are pointing out, you're not going to get through this process if even a small group of highly motivated people want to make a lot of noise about it. So you better be sure that you've talked to as many people as you can. And I think, you know, when we were expanding the bid, we worked very hard to make sure that those smaller properties were paying very little money. And it was something like, I don't have the figures right in front of me, but it was something like 75% of the people were paying $600 or less a year, right? And a lot of them were paying even less than that. But but that was a lot of people, and we had to talk to as many of them as possible, because a number of them were the ones who were the most like, the city's supposed to do this stuff. Like, why am I being asked to pay when the city's supposed to? So we had to walk through what we were going to be doing that was different than what the city did. And that one of the things that bids are very, very useful for is holding the city's feet to the fire to make sure they do what they are supposed to do. And they don't ignore you and leave the pothole or cut services and so on. I mean, unfortunately, right now in the city, because the budgets overall have gone down, it's hard to hold them to the same sanitation level, let's say, that they were doing last year. But if, in a given year, they start shifting money around, right? You could say, wait a minute, we used to have 7-day-a-week service. What is going on here? Or you said you were going to fix this. Why haven't you fixed this? Or you need to fix this, and so on.
That's very important for conservancies. When you're forming a park conservancy, is to baseline what the city is spending on the park already, and make sure that when you're forming a conservancy for a park, the city commits to spending that sum of money even after you take over operations in the park formally.
Right. And I don't run a park, but I know that, like, in Casey, who works with the absolutely gorgeous Hunters Point South parks, what the conservancy pays for is different than what the city pays for, right? And a lot of you, right? So, and I think that's what people have to understand, is that you're not relieving the city of its responsibilities, but there's things that they don't fund, and you're going to make sure that those things, which are very, very necessary, are funded. But this principal argument, and again, the people who you may have, most of the people are paying very, very little money. It may be a penny a year or $1 a year, but you have to pay just as much attention to them, because they can object just as effectively as somebody who may be paying $100,000 a year. So, when I look at, where we're looking at some other expansion right now, I look at, first and foremost, two things: who's paying the most, and what are most people paying? And then you've got to make sure that both of those groups of people are happy. You could have 5 people who are paying really big tickets, or 10 people, who are the top 10 payers. Who are they? Is this something they want? Are they comfortable with that amount of money? And then you've got to look at the mass of people, and is what we're doing relevant to them? And, can we do the kind of outreach where we can talk to lots and lots and lots of them? And some of that's surveys, but a lot of it has to be conversations. And that's why it gets time consuming and lengthy. And I would say, even if you're using consultants to help you, you are wise to be engaged in a lot of that outreach directly. You speak at the meetings, you talk to people, you have lunch and learns or whatever, because a big thing here is people feeling comfortable with you, that you are the kind are going to do something that they're entrusting you to do this the right way. That when we say it's not going to be replacing the city services, it's like, okay, I know you in this organization are for real, and I can see how we're going to communicate. But the presentations that we did all along, very similar, to what Blaze was showing. You got to go back to 101. What is this? What is this not? And my first presentation, I was like, look, this is really of the people, by the people, for the people. Because as much as it says in the law, the mayor can initiate, the reality is that this is a grassroots thing that comes from the community, with people in that community deciding they need something, and they're going to put in money to pay for it, do it for themselves. And then, even though there are 4 government representatives on the board, the members control what happens to this money. So yes, you're assessing, the city's collecting it, but that's a formality in a sense.
Right.
You still have a vote. It's not like you create it and then it goes away. And again, that was something that people didn't understand, and they were worried about. It was like, well, once it's created, the city's just gonna dump, make it pay more. The mechanics, the legalities take a lot of explaining. But a lot of times, once people really understand that, they get more comfortable and they back down. But at the end of the day, it's got to be something that they're comfortable with the principle of. Otherwise, you'll never get past it.
This sounds very time consuming and expensive. And so my question for Blaze is, before we open it up to questions from all of the participants, is where is this money going to come from for this process? So I chair the board of a small business association in Riverdale in the Bronx. We have 50 members. We have a budget of $30,000 a year. It's an all volunteer organization. We need a bid. Where am I possibly going to come up with the $100,000 I need to get through a bid formation process?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a couple different sources, I guess, where I would point people toward. I think, both on the sort of traditional fundraising side, I typically, it's not unusual that we see, in commercial districts, that there's like maybe a couple key property owners who sort of initiated this idea, who might want to sort of preemptively, put up what would be a bid assessment essentially toward sort of seed money, or almost like a challenge grant of some kind, to kind of at least initiate the process. So sometimes, so those are going to be property owners, maybe anchor institutions. On the sort of public funding side, we at SBS, we certainly manage some discretionary funding that council members put toward efforts like this. So there's, either, sort of council initiatives, they call them. There's one called a Neighborhood Development Grant Initiative, which was formed during this administration, and again, depending on the council, could live on, but allowed council members to allocate 1 or 2 grants per district towards work that could entail sort of merchant organizing or bid formation work. So again, I think if your council members already on board or supportive, or at least conceptually interested in pursuing something like this, I think it's worth kind of getting them on board.
Yep.
We do have grant funding, but it's typically targeted very much towards low to moderate income communities. So again, conceptually, I think if there was an organization, typically, I talked, so say, there are some neighborhood wide organizations, maybe even a housing organization or others that are doing some amount of commercial district focused work, but they might do more than that. And they are definitely kind of fall within our world of grantees. So there could always be a potential partnership there.
I have one other question before I open it up to participants. How many bids are in formation in New York City right now that you're aware of? And do any of them focus largely on parks?
I was just reviewing that today, actually. So there's not a straight answer, because there are groups out there, believe it or not, who would say like, oh yeah, we're doing bid formation, but my team doesn't know about it. So there's a bucket of probably 10 that I would say are just like inquiry phase, right? They've asked us about it, say they're interested, but haven't really formed a steering committee. Until a steering committee is formed, which is sort of that formal, sort of, semi-formal entity that could in theory turn into a board of directors and is going to kind of make up sort of the heavy decision making, among their, there's probably, I'm going to probably get this number wrong, but I would say somewhere between 15 and 20 that are in various stages of either pure planning, pure outreach, and then we have some that I would probably say are in like a pre-legislative phase. Like they probably would be in legislative phase if COVID hadn't hit,
Right.
But things have been somewhat on hold. So in terms of any that truly, none come to mind that I would say are explicitly right around sort of a built around park management.
Okay. So given our
actually
time, we
say-
should open it up. I'm sorry, go ahead, Liz.
No, I was just going to say that if you look at the boundaries of a number of bids, they were actually drawn to exclude the park because you didn't want to have to provide services that you weren't getting any money for, and you didn't want to relieve the city of its obligations to manage
Right.
that park.
That's a good point. We should open it up to participants. And I don't know how to call on people. Katie has a question. I can see that your hand is up, but if I'm missing anyone, Diana, please call on them instead of me. But Katie.
Okay, well, go ahead, Katie. Can I go? Okay, thanks, Chris. First of all, Diana and Cheryl, thank you so much. They're sort of the lead organizers of this. This was so illuminating. And Chris, you're just wonderful, as with all the other speakers. I have so many questions, but I'm going to put it down to 2. And one is, Connie, you had said over 80%. Right, of approval. And Chris, I've heard you say a couple of times that it's more like 51%. And so that's something that I'm really curious about. What is it and how can it be inconsistent?
I'm
And
going to
Chris,
give you the
hold on.
legal answer and someone else
Okay.
will give you the real answer.
Okay, cool.
Go
And
for
my
your
other
second
question, my second question is really about you, Liz. And so I worked with you for so many years, and I don't have the answer to this question, is I know the difference between the partnership and the bid. I know what they do, but what I'm curious about is the impetus of why, when it was formed, why was it two entities? And I think that that's something that we, as many of us are community-based organizations, providing community services. So some of us have talked about if it makes sense to have an LICP bid model where it's actually two entities. And my third question is about residential, right? You know, the differences between commercial and residential, which we talked about before in terms of, you know, having it primarily be the assessments on commercial versus residential, which I understand residential is more, is a newer approach and potentially more difficult. And that's it. Thank you all.
So I want to answer from a legal perspective about the percentages. The New York state law says within New York City, the city council has the power to form a business improvement district or a park improvement district without getting the approval of property owners that would be within it. And the only way the property owners can sort of kill the effort, the legislation, is to formally get 51% of property owners to object, to affirmatively object. And to me, that said that the state legislature in 1989 understood how hard it would be to organize property owners and residents in New York City versus in other communities. And so they wanted to create a different process. And so I find it a little bit confounding and frustrating that the City Planning Commission, maybe SBS, but I won't take my frustration out on Blaze, impose a different requirement, which require really you to show affirmatively that this vast majority of property owners support the formation. And so that now is a question for Liz or Blaze or anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, I can touch on a little bit of that. I mean, well, yeah, so one, I've been at SBS almost 7 years. So yeah, so some of these efforts predate my time. And previous to that, I was at a bid. So I think the 85%, as far as I could tell, and I obviously again was not with the city. I mean, that is I think, I don't know if that was unique to that NID effort, given that it was kind of setting a new, some new ground and I think the city sort of being cautious and wanting to ensure that there was broad residential support. Others have told me that SBS used to require 85% support for traditional bids as well, but I have actually never seen evidence to that fact, like in any sort of documentation. So I leave that where it is right now. I think to Chris's point, we do say sort of 51% or majority support to demonstrated support. We kind of use the term broad-based support because we do get a lot of, there is sort of an underlying pressure to ensure that while property owners, right, are inherently in control through much of this process and are ultimately responsible for paying the assessment, that you want to ensure that commercial tenants and residential tenants are also in the loop. They may not, right? And so they may not need to demonstrate as much support as the property owners, but I think our hope is that they are involved in the steering committee, since they will need to be on a future board, that there's outreach done to them. And I think to a certain extent it's true. It covers some political bases to ensure that, the storyline when you're communicating in front of City Planning Commission and the community board and the city council, that work has been done. And so so I think to Chris's point, I mean, I have, in my time with the city and being aware of the bid world, I think there has been this emphasis on ensuring that bids are sort of a grassroots effort and then a community wants them and they're not imposed upon them. And so because of that, I think there has been an emphasis consistently on reaching majority support. But I think if you ever had, an elected official, whether it's a council member or a mayor, who really were willing to, kind of put themselves out there and push something forward because they felt it was necessary and were kind of willing to own its success or failure, then I think and again, I'm not speaking for the administration here, but I think one could, in theory, make that case and say that, hey, this is something we need, and kind of stake their political capital in it and bring the community along with them.
So if I'm getting 100 letters sent to SBS, I want 51 of them to say we support it.
Um, in a nutshell, I mean, again, the statement of, I mean, the statement of support. I mean, look, there's like when people put stuff in, there's a lot of people who won't put stuff in writing, right? Any sort of support letter, but yeah, like during the planning phase, it's important to look at again what the assessment formula will be, what the boundaries will be, what the proposed services are. So I mean, the goal is to get 51 in support, but that they're actually they know what they're signing on to, right? Just like you can get a bunch of random people signing a petition that's opposing something. I mean, honestly, bid formation has gotten more, I don't know if it's more controversial, but let's just say there's, as we all know, a lot of misinformation out there in today's day and age, and therefore like crazy amounts of opposition get drummed up by things that are not factually correct. And so I think someone's point, and maybe Liz's, that you kind of need to get ahead of that stuff and make sure that this is as much a political organizing and PR game to ensure that you're kind of controlling the storyline a little bit.
Liz, I think the second part of the question is for you.
Yeah, and also just on that, I mean, I think that there was a period in which city planning was getting more and more specific. Like it wasn't just support, you had to have support from owners, from retailers, from commercial tenants, from residents. They wanted to see overwhelming support in each group. And I would say the reality is that it's not just how much support. And I think Blaise is right that things have become a little bit more realistic about if you show that you have done the outreach, right? That you've had the public meetings, that they've been advertised, that you've done the mailings, that you've done all these things, even if you can't have documented support from, 85%. I think the problem is if you have documented opposition, right, Blaise? I mean, I think that's fair to say. Like if you have a significant, even if it's 20%, of documented opposition, you're probably not going to make it through the city council or the city or city planning. And so, you have to, you want to make sure that you're not doing. The other thing is somebody at the end of the process is always going to jump up and say, I had no idea this was going on. So it's very important that you've documented, no, we sent the letters, we sent all the things we're supposed to be. And if you didn't bother to read them, and it just has a lot less weight then. Katie, on why a partnership and a bid, it's different when they're exactly contiguous, right? But the partnership covers a much bigger area in which we don't provide all those services. And we have other contracts, other things, other kinds of funding that goes on. So first of all, a bid has to have a district management association. That is part of the law. So there has to be an organization that is a 501c3 that is set up to manage that organization, that signs the contract with the city, that receives the money, all that sort of stuff. It also has to operate according to that contract with the city. And it has to have the mayor and et cetera on the board, right? That's perfectly fine for what the bid does, but the partnership does all sorts of other things. We don't want the board to be that board. We don't want all of our procurements to be the same as the so it's both there's a lot of other things that are just unrelated to the bid, but the specific governance of the bid should stay on the bid, and it just keeps things much cleaner. In our case, we manage the bid. We have a management contract with the bid. Everything we do with the, that the bid does, all the procurements that the bid pays for, whatever, it follows all the appropriate rules and so on. But for example, we have staff people whose focus is the bid, but they are paid for through the partnership. The bid reimburses the partnership because we want to give those people health insurance. We want to give them, benefits and all these things. And in today's world, it was different years ago, but in today's world, it's really hard for an organization with one or two people, right, to provide all those things at a reasonable cost. So, and this way we don't pay 2 unemployment insurance fees and all sorts of things like that. And just one thing on the residential, when bids were originally created, there was no problem. If there were residents there, they were assessed. If you look at Union Square, there was no fuss. The Zeckendorf Towers is part of the assessment. Again, there became a desire, particularly city planning, at some point not to have that in there. And part of that was because some people were trying to create RIDs, residential improvement districts, like taking over the Upper East Side. And that was felt to be sort of trying to set up a gated community. But the reality is now in today's world, many, many business districts like Long Island City, like Hudson Yards and elsewhere are mixed use districts. And the residential buildings, particularly the large scale residential rentals, are getting the same benefit as the commercial building, and the same value, and they want the services. and they are creating a need for a higher level of service because you have so many people. So it's important that they be contributing into the bid budget.
And
Again, they're paying for things that now they want the same things that the business building does as well, and are also getting a benefit from
I
it.
think when we're talking about park improvement districts, particularly in the outer boroughs, they are almost certainly going to be majority residential property owners around the parks. And so you are almost certainly going to be assessing residential property owners and residential buildings to fund that park improvement district.
I will say in most places now where the residents are assessed, it is as part of a mixed use building, where
Uh-huh.
there's retail and so on involved. I think it's still pretty rare, right, Blaze, that a wholly residential building is assessed more than a nominal dollar a year. So you just have to, but again, it's all about cui bono, who is benefiting from the services,
Yeah.
who is benefiting from the park, and having that nexus back to who is paying the assessment.
I mean, I do think it's worth noting. I think Connie had a couple of the bids on her slide. Some of the older bids actually did assess residential, mostly because they just don't distinguish between a residential or commercial. So I had to testify to this a few weeks ago at City Planning Commission. I think we looked through, and there's 17 bids, I think, that assess residential. Again, either because they don't distinguish, because there probably wasn't a lot of residential in their district when their district plans are created, or to Liz's point, are mixed use in nature. So, in this administration, actually the first one I helped guide through was an expansion of the MetroTech bid into, what the BAM Cultural District, and that MetroTech bid does does assess residential. And, we expanded that bid into an area that was going to have new residential development. And, we successfully brought that through City Planning Commission without, it was a discussion point, but it wasn't an obstacle.
Diana, are we able to go a few minutes over to take more questions from participants?
Yeah, it's fine with me, and folks can say
Cheryl,
if they can.
that's okay? Okay. Are there any other questions?
There was a question in the chat that's kind of related to when Liz was talking about partnerships. This is from Rosamond. Rather than forming a new bid, can any of you talk to options for conservancies to access existing bid assessments through partnership or changes in their district plan?
I mean, I don't have a straightforward answer to this, but I mean, I see like Rosamund on here from Fort Greene Park. I mean, right, so the Myrtle Avenue bid that I formed and used to run, the Fort Greene Park is within the boundaries of the bid because it fronts Myrtle Avenue. And so as a tax lot, we drew it into the bid. I know the bid partners with
Right.
on some programming and things, and maybe you'd want to touch on that, but it doesn't from an administrative standpoint or staffing standpoint, I don't think there's any overlap.
Right. Correct. But I'm just curious too, like, how hard is it to change a district plan as well? If, let's say, a park is not part of it, to Liz's point, they're often cut out of them. Is it something where a bid or a couple of bids in partnership with a conservancy would be willing to try and undertake collectively an idea of supporting public space in a certain area, or is that just completely crazy?
Yeah. No, it's not that, it's not that radical. I mean, we're there's two slightly different things there. So one is changing the boundaries of a bid. So right now, like the Flatiron bid is going through an expansion. So that does require, and like what Liz went through, like that requires, again, the steering committee to get a geographical expansion. And that does have to go through the same as a formation process because it's a land use action. So you do go through. So if that park were carved out and you wanted to add it, you would have to do that. If you're just doing a district plan amendment, so just like the document, not changing boundaries, but changing, services that are offered or changing the assessment formula or any other number of things, that could be done just with city council. So essentially it would be like working with SBS and the law department and essentially like queuing up a bill to be passed through council.
Thank you.
But I don't know if I didn't know if that addressed the initial question, but yeah, it's again, sort of theoretically possible, but no immediate ones come to mind, but I think like a lot of these types of organizations, I mean, there is a lot to be said for sort of economies of scale and sharing overhead or sharing programmatic expenses. So, I think if a park plays a really prominent role in a neighborhood or a commercial district, I certainly think it's possible. And I think, again, more and more bids have been managing plazas, which,
Right.
to a certain extent, which I know they're quite different, but I think more bids have become comfortable at least with the possibility.
I know at Washington Square Park, we often work with our local Village Alliance Business Improvement District, but we always run into that, like, when it comes to spending money, right? So, that bid has to spend money in its borders, and we're just outside. So they can do certain things, right? They could fundraise if they wanted to, on our behalf, but that you always run into that money issue, which makes things kind of tough when it comes down to brass tacks, so.
I think it's just important to remember that the bid, but a given bid's budget is part of that district plan that gets passed by the city council. So if you want to raise your budget, you have to go back to the city council, and you have to go through a process and everything. So it's not just like, hey, let's spend some more money, right? Like you have to go through the whole rigmarole to change it, and your members have to agree to that, and so on. And most bids, even frankly the ones that have a lot of money, they're spending a lot of money. I mean, that the most of that money goes right out the door into direct services, and so there really isn't a lot of you know extra that you can sort of, oh well, let's do this, let's do that. And the other thing is that liability, and I know this has been a big issue on some of the plazas and taking on parklets and things like that, is that if you're also taking on like the trip and fall liability and so on, that can cost more than the services. So that's also made a lot of the smaller bids very hesitant to take on additional public space responsibility. Like when I'm sweeping right now, I don't have to pay the same insurance as if I was managing a park. And so it's, that can become prohibitive. You have to make sure, and I would just say the last thing, anybody who does anything like this, make sure there's enough money in the budget to cover, what you need to cover, because that's the other thing, is sometimes you get so caught up in trying to keep the budget down so that people will like it, that you don't leave yourself enough money to operate. But the reality is, once you cross the principal threshold, is this something I'm willing to pay for? It's much easier to get people to pay a reasonable amount of money to do the services. Just making it smaller and smaller and smaller isn't going to buy off anybody, who otherwise doesn't like the idea.
Are there any other questions?
See another in the chat that relates to SBS, so I'll answer that. About, does city council have ultimate say or SBS? So just to address that, ultimately it's city council and the mayor. It's like passing anything into law. So to be clear, SBS, obviously, as part of the administration, we sort of provide the technical assistance and the guidance. I think one could argue we're sort of playing a bit of a gatekeeper role, only in the sense that, like, we're not written into the law. Like, we don't need to be there. Like, if a community wanted to do this without us, they certainly could. But I think there was a certain amount of right, if there's a ton of opposition, like the city planning commission really want a massive scene there, or the city council want a scene at the public hearing. Like, there's a little bit of a hey, let's just make sure we've all done our homework and kind of queue this up. But we're if anything, we're obviously supportive of bids, but I don't think we think a bid is the right answer in every situation. So in that sense, I guess we're sort of agnostic, but we would, if someone's working on this, we're going to provide whatever guidance and support as we can. And then once there is a majority support, then we'll do our best to kind of queue it up through the legislative process, which is, there's a lot of hurdles and hoops you have to jump through, and we'll try to make that as simple as possible.
Yeah, I would say that gatekeeping role that SBS plays is really important, because SBS sees what's going on, knows what's going to make it through, and they're trying to help you be prepared and not waste your time entering into the legislative process, right? But without having a very strong chance of success. So I'd say everything that is happening with there is designed to help you be successful in the end, or to know if you're not going to be, and then don't waste your time and money. Go back to the drawing board or do something different. So I would say it would be really, really a mistake not to work with SBS, whatever the law may say. you're very well served by the guidance that SBS is going to give.
So maybe we should break it here, Cheryl and Diana.
Yeah, that
And,
sounds good.
I had about 10 questions I wrote down. I got to 2 of them. So March 4th will be the continuation. So thanks to Liz and to Blaze and to Connie and to Tony and Diana and Cheryl and Heather for participating and allowing me to ask some questions.
And thank all of you for keeping our city beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, and please do sign up for the Eventbrite that's in the chat for the second session if you haven't already. It should be a great panel of speakers. We'll have Hudson Yards Health Kitchen Alliance, New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program at Hudson River Foundation, 3rd Avenue Bid, and Downtown Brooklyn Partnership. So looking forward to that one as well. I hope our panelists on this session can join us there as well, and maybe some of those questions can creep back in. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening.
Good night.